Hey everybody, welcome back to the Catholic Culture Podcast. Recently, over on the website catholicculture.org, I wrote an article about my experience learning Latin over the last couple of years, and particularly focusing on this wonderful method that I found much more enjoyable and effective than the ways that I had been taught Latin in school, the ways many of us are taught in school. And it's a very practically oriented article, pretty thorough, and I'll link to that article in the show notes for this episode. And I also wanted to talk about it on the podcast, but I didn't want to just rehash the article, so I thought I'd bring someone else on with me to talk about Latin learning and the world, the community that exists, and the different methods that are available. My guest today, Ryan Hammill, is the executive director and co-founder of the Ancient Language Institute, and he is the co-host of the excellent podcast, New Humanist. Ryan, welcome to the Catholic Culture Podcast.
I'm honored. Thanks for having me, Thomas.
Well, I figured I'd mention up front this conference that I just attended, which you're, of course, familiar with. The Paideia Institute every year puts on the Living Latin in New York City conference, and this year, just a couple weekends ago, it was hosted at Fordham in Manhattan, and it was quite an interesting experience. I mean, first of all, just the novelty of walking around hallways and hearing people conversing in Latin, that was really amazing. And then the conference is made up of a mix of lectures and classroom sessions. The lectures are mostly in Latin, some in Greek, a few in English, and the classroom sessions are mostly in Latin. And I found with my level of experience that the lectures in Latin went over my head to a large extent. Classroom sessions were extremely helpful, and I would definitely attend again. And it's not a Catholic conference, but there were, I guess, unsurprisingly, a lot of Catholics there. Like, I went to a diner for lunch with a few strangers, and turned out all four of us were Catholic, So that kind of thing was happening. I did see one priest
Many
there.
such cases.
Yeah, exactly. Have you ever been to the Living Latin Conference?
I haven't. It's one of those, you should be making the annual pilgrimage if you're serious about this stuff, but I've never gone. Someday I will. Last night I went and spoke in Latin for an hour and a half at Red Robin down the street with some friends and kind of scared everybody around us. But no, I'd love to go. I've heard great things. Luke Ranieri, who was one of the first people to kind of throw in his lot with us over at Ancient Language Institute and help us out, help build our Greek program, and has just done amazing stuff for us. He's been going for a long time. I know.
Yeah.
I know you met him. I saw the picture.
Yeah.
So, and there were some other ALI people there.
Yes. Colin Gorey was there.
Yeah. Yeah. So someday I'll cross the country and make it, but I'm over here on the left coast. So.
Right. Well, I mean, nonetheless, though, you're a lot more familiar than I am with this scene, this world of international world, really, of fluent Latin speakers. And I mean, I think most people have no idea this exists. And not only that, but it was observed by, I think Jason Petticone at the conference, who runs the Paideia Institute. I think it was him who brought up the fact that, this was probably the largest gathering of Latinists in New York City ever. And wow. Yet there wasn't anybody. There were some university professors from around the country, but there wasn't anybody from any of the classics departments at any of the great New York City colleges and universities at the conference. And so, I'm sure you are better able to explain that, than I would be. But I mean, what's kind of this strange gap that exists between the world of people who are not necessarily academics? Some of them are teachers, some of them are at independent organizations, or some of the people I met were Latin high school teachers, in the city, for instance. A friend of mine who just started writing for our site, David Bonagura, who teaches Latin at this really prestigious Jesuit high school in Manhattan, Regis High School. He was there, but not so many, academics from New York. What's going on? What's up with the split between these worlds?
Good question. Yeah, I mean, sometimes they're like making sandwiches at a deli in the grocery store, and then they go home and get on Zoom calls where they speak for hours and hours in ancient Greek and Latin. I mean, this is a story of one of our teachers. This is where we found him.
Wow.
Making sandwiches, and then happens to just be able to speak in fluent Greek and fluent Latin, just kind of ad nauseum, as long as he has something to say. And there's lots of people like this, and they tend not to be, endowed professors with endowed chairs at colleges. I mean, why does it happen? What's the whole history of it? I'm not entirely sure, but it definitely, you're absolutely right that it has this kind of insurgent, dissident quality. That there's these people outside of the mainstream of academia who are the vanguard of this very heady, scholarly, academic endeavor. It's not, if you'll indulge me to make the parallel, it's not unlike what happened in the Renaissance with the humanists, where you had a very established scholarly community, these kind of late medieval scholastics and jurists who dominated the medieval universities of Europe, including in Italy. And then you had Petrarch and all his friends, who they're kind of like independent scholars. Some of them were politicians or they were tutors, but they weren't the people running the universities. They weren't the people drawing big audiences for lectures in those universities. And nevertheless, they were the ones pushing a kind of revolution in Latinity to kind of purify the Latin language and bring it closer to its classical roots, to rediscover all these manuscripts, and then to reintroduce Greek, which had fallen out of use in Europe for centuries and centuries, even though they weren't the establishment. So it's, maybe it's a bit of a stretch, but at least there's an analogy there that there's a difference. I would say the distinction for your audience to keep in mind is there's a difference between classical scholarship and classical education. There's the scholarship, which is these people in these blue chip universities writing dissertations on, this one hapax legomena from Homer. And where does it come from? Oh, well, we'll, come up with some theory that it's a borrowing from Hittite. And it's like, nothing against that. That stuff is useful. But then there's people who want to speak Latin and to read Virgil in Latin and then talk about Virgil in Latin. This is a more kind of humanistic, as what I would put under the heading of classical education.
Yeah, that's a great point. And so, okay, they're speaking Latin. Some people might not immediately see the utility of that. That was not my main goal when beginning to learn Latin. I'm starting to see, the utility of learning to speak Latin for being able to read Latin, which is my main interest. But I mean, to put a point on what you just said, and this is something I mentioned in my article, it seems to be fair to say that many, if not most, classicists, meaning academic classicists today, don't read Latin fluently, at least not the sort of the most difficult classical authors. So Mary Beard, who's sort of a celebrity classicist, I guess you could say. I don't know much about her work, but she admitted a while back that she doesn't read Latin fluently. And what that means is to be able to read it without constantly stopping, consulting, a dictionary or whatever, translating mentally, to be able to read it as though it were, as though you had learned French or German as a second language and were simply reading and able to think to some extent, at least, in that language. And that was certainly my goal in my ongoing process of learning Latin, I should say. But the fact that many people who are professional classicists can't do this in Latin and Greek is kind of startling. And it seems like there's some resistance to that for historical reasons. Maybe they have this sort of preconceived notion that, well, it's sort of pointless or frivolous or just for some obscure reason impossible to do this with a dead language. But then the other big thing is just the currently predominant methodology for teaching and learning Latin in schools, definitely at the university level and very often at the high school level. And so that seems to account for it a lot, because I've been using this particular method that I discussed in the article for a little over 2 years to learn. I've gotten to the point where I'm now reading the Gospel of Matthew, and other than the fact that there are words I don't know, I can read it pretty relatively easily. Now, granted,
It's awesome.
am quite familiar with the Gospel of Matthew in English.
Right.
So that helps. But then nonetheless, I'm not finding that I have to translate in my head a lot, unless there's some like weird grammatical, formation that I haven't come across in the style of the Vulgate. Yeah, so I guess, we can come back to the scene, but we should probably talk about methodology too.
Absolutely.
Because that has a lot to do with this formation, that one gets in your distinction between classical education and classical scholarship. So I don't know, should we talk about method first, or should we talk about like the reasons for learning Latin first?
Let's talk about
debate.
method. I think the method will bring us to the reasons.
Okay.
And yeah, I think that like talking about reasons for classics and for Latin and all this stuff, you kind of come to it best by talking about particulars. And so,
okay.
Yeah, I think that, your essay does a good job of laying it out. I think
which you helped me with on the methodology part of it.
Well, I was happy to point you in some helpful directions. But yeah, people should read it, and it gives a good overview of kind of, there's more or less two basic camps. And so you can call one the grammar translation camp, and that's probably what most people are familiar with. And when people think about studying a language, they will just automatically picture this. And then there's the kind of natural method, direct method, communicative. It has lots of terms people use. Yeah. And so the grammar translation, the name's right. The name gives it to you. It's a focus on explicit instruction in grammatical forms, and then doing translation exercises to like master those forms. So here's a lecture on the perfect and the imperfect tenses, and now here's a line from Ovid that includes perfect and imperfect. Find them and render the sentence into English, and use the dictionary to look up as many words as you need to, because there's a whole bunch of vocabulary packed into this one sentence that you've never seen before, because you've never read Ovid before, because you hardly read. You just get tiny little snippets of Latin in your whole education. You're not sitting down and cracking it open like you would Lord of the Rings and being like, oh, this is fun. And so if people kind of think of that and imagine it being hard and tedious, they are right. It's not how you successfully learned your mother tongue. And if you've learned a second language in the meantime, you probably didn't learn your second language that way either. You probably learned it with a more communicative method. And so these communicative methods, however you want to talk about them, can really range from immersion, which is probably going to give you the most kind of closest to learning your mother tongue, drop you into Spain. And if you want to survive, you got to speak Spanish. So nobody there speaks English. No offense to the Spaniards.
That was my experience, actually, when I went to Spain.
Okay.
People in Stockholm, everybody speaks English.
Yes.
In Austria, most people speak some English. In Italy, some people speak English. Spanish, a lot fewer people speak English.
Yeah, I took a gap year before going to college and lived in the Tizé community, this ecumenical monastery in the French countryside, but they get young people from all over Europe coming. And you get really good at identifying by sight people's nationality. Like you can tell an Italian from 50 yards. And then you also get very familiar with, they're German. They're definitely going to speak English, or they're Spanish. Definitely not. That was a very fun linguistic experience being there. Mm-hmm. But anyways, so immersion is that's not the only communicative method, but that's what a lot of people in the communicative world want to do, is have fully immersive Latin classrooms where you walk in and nobody's speaking English and the teacher's just speaking Latin at you, and you're like reading some Latin stories. The teacher's acting stuff out. So TPRS and acting, all this stuff is kind of in that domain. Not everyone's into full immersion. I'm not into full immersion. I think it actually can be less efficient to never use English to explain something hard. Right. But what all of these methods have in common is this idea that you need to be taking in a lot of input. So you'll hear the phrase comprehensible input. Take in a lot of input because your mind is a language learning machine. Everyone does it. Everyone learns a language. If you speak your mother tongue, you learned a language. Your mind is built for this. Yeah. So you need to give it lots of input, just like when you were a kid. And your mom pointed to a tree and said tree. And you're like, oh, that's a tree. And then you need to be practicing and doing the output too. Speaking, writing. People disagree about should you have a silent period, blah, blah, blah. But we don't need to get into
That's the part that
that.
I haven't done much of, is the output part, until I got to this conference.
Right. Yeah. So did you get a chance to speak at Paideia?
In the I didn't really speak in Latin outside of the classroom sessions, but the classroom sessions were what convinced me. Actually, they made me really much more interested in taking a class than I was before, and studying in a group setting so that I would have an opportunity to speak in Latin. Because just the little bit that we did there, and some of the games we played, and also just examining Latin texts in Latin, sort of summarizing them in simplified Latin, that kind of thing.
Yes.
Just the way I could feel my my brain working was like, okay, I can tell this is important.
Yeah, and so one thing I should make clear is there are some people who see Latin speech as a goal. They want to be able to speak well in Latin. And I think all the people in this community generally, we'd like to be able to speak well. But that's really an end in and of itself. The speaking is. But you don't have to have the goal of, I want to just be able to discourse at will in Latin. Right. To do this communicative method. Because I think that speaking in Latin, and then I'll just say writing, because I really see these as the same thing, just in different genres. Mm-hmm. Is composing in Latin, writing things in Latin. Are really incredibly helpful tools for learning the language, so that you can read it well. Yeah. And it will just slow down your acquisition of the language, and thus your reading ability to never produce, whether it's writing or speaking. You're just hurting yourself. And so it's really good to do, even if your goal isn't to give a speech in Latin. Right. What the effect that has is teaching you to appreciate Latin as its own language rather than as a code for English. And this is one of the big problems with the grammar translation method, is because you memorize a vocab list, or don't even do that, you just look up words in a dictionary for their translation, and you learn a grammar rule, and then you translate a Latin text into English, you're training your mind to see Latin as a code.
Yes.
Oh, this thing has meaning that will be revealed to me once it's in English. And then you're always at a remove. Whereas if you're learning a Latin word with more Latin words, or learning a Latin word with pictures, so this is the first illustrated textbook, I believe, in history, was a Latin textbook that did this. This is John Amos Comenius, who's a Czech, Bohemian, I think, educator. And he's like, if we want to teach a language, we need to teach it the same way we learn our native language, which is associate a word with an image. And so he has these old woodcuts, very homey. Orbis Pictus is the book. But that's what Forcalini does. That's what speaking it does. That's what associating with images does.
Yeah. And let me read this C.S. Lewis quote, which I used in my article. I just borrowed it from a piece on the ALI website. So this is from his autobiography, Surprised by Joy, and it just is a great way of expressing what you're talking about. So he says, those in whom the Greek word lives only while they are hunting for it in the lexicon, and who then substitute the English word for it, are not reading the Greek at all. They are only solving a puzzle. The very formula nous means a ship is wrong. Nous and ship both mean a thing. They do not mean one another. Behind nous, as behind navis or naka, we want to have a picture of a dark, slender mass with sail or oars climbing the ridges with no officious English word intruding.
Oh, so good. So good. You can always count on Lewis for a good illustration of a concept.
Yeah.
So that comes from the his account of like the turning point in his education. So for people, you really have to read Surprised by Joy. It's such a good book for anybody who hasn't. But the turning point in his education, he has he's missing joints in his thumbs or something. So he stinks at sports, and the English boarding schools that his father sends him to, which is just torture. Like, they're obsessed with sports. So he stinks at sports.
They're all molesting each other.
Yes, that too. But he says he gives 1 or 2 pages to how bad World War I trenches were, and multiple chapters about how bad boarding schools were. So he's terrible at sports. He has this horrible Irish accent that all the English kids make fun of him for. And so he finally convinces his father to let him leave the boarding school and go be tutored by his father's own tutor, the old Knock Kirkpatrick. And this is he shows up at Kirkpatrick's house, this very stern kind of atheist Presbyterian. He has all the manner and morals of a Presbyterian, but he's a total rationalist skeptic. But one of the things he does is just hand him Homer. And he's like, how far can you read and understand it? Tell me what it says. And they'd have these contests, how far they could go without looking anything up. And then there's this point that's what you just read, where it flips from Lewis translating Homer in order to understand him, to just understanding Homer.
Yeah.
And that's what we're going for in language education, is where navis doesn't mean ship. Navis immediately calls to mind,
the phantasm.
Exactly.
Yeah, well, okay, so maybe we should talk a little bit about Orberg, because that's the focus of my article. And so Orberg has this great reputation as among the proponents of the natural method, as kind of the master craftsman of the natural method language textbook. So he wrote this Lingua Latina per se illustrata, Latin language illustrated through itself. And there's 2 books, Familia Romana and Roma Eterna. But I went through, over the past couple of years, I went through Familia Romana. And so just to give people a gauge, like I said, once you're most of the way through that, you'll be ready to start reading like scripture in Latin. You'll be, you probably can start praying the divine office in Latin. You might not understand every single thing, but you're kind of ready to start going into those texts. It is a truly amazing work. So I guess the first edition was published in the 1950s. This Danish linguist, and like I said, it's illustrated through itself. So the entire book's in Latin, and the grammar explanations are in Latin, and there's pictures and there's marginal notes, which kind of help you to understand the context. So I think the first sentence in the book is Roma in Italia est. Anybody can understand what that means, right? And then you go from there, and it's, there's various books that use a similar method, but this one is so beautifully constructed and so entertaining to read through. And the way that he repeats concepts is not tedious. It's like you almost don't notice it sometimes, how he is varying a concept and repeating it and sort of drilling it in the course of a story or a description of, the culture of whatever century, first century Rome. And so it's beautifully done. And, I would just encourage anybody who wants to learn Latin, just grab that book. There's supplemental books, that exercise books and things that I talk about in my article that I used as well. But if you just get that book, it will change your experience of Latin learning. Yeah.
Undoubtedly. Yeah. For people, you hear language textbook and you're like, okay, I imagine I'll get like some explanations of things and then lists of words and then, like activities I have to do, applying all that in this kind of grammar translation fashion. And you pick up the book and you're very surprised to find that it's a story. The overwhelming bulk of the book is just talking about this family, this Roman family, and their like misadventures over the course. I think it all happens over like 48 hours.
Oh, really?
It's long, yeah.
Wow.
But it's a long book. Like, I've got it right here.
35 chapters.
Yeah, 300 pages.
Yeah.
And then, at the end of chapters, it has these very short, simple explanations of the grammar that pops up in each chapter. But the bulk of it is just, improbus Marcus, who hits his sister and laughs and is pushed into the pool, and, the loyal slave and the lazy bad slave who runs away. I won't spoil too much. And then it ends with, this scene of a Roman dinner party where they're reciting Latin poetry, and you're reading Ovid out of the mouths of various characters.
Right.
And so it's a very surprising way to teach a language. But as the experience of countless people, us two right here included, attest, it works really, 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 really well. It's perhaps the best language textbook ever made for any language. And it came out of this strange ephemeral organization, the Nature Method Institute, that nobody really knows exactly the history of it. People have done all these investigations to try and find it. They produced a bunch of these books. You can go find the French one. You can go find the Italian one.
Right.
I think there's a Russian one that nobody's been able to find. So I've heard rumors it's like hidden in the Michigan State University Library. I don't know if that's true.
Amazing.
But Orberg, one way or another, got the copyright back from the Nature Method Institute, I imagine, after it folded, and then kept improving the book based on his experience in the classroom.
Right.
And so it's become a great book for autodidacts like yourself. All these people have taught themselves Latin using it. However, I don't think it was really meant for that. And so a lot of people will start with it and then realize like, okay, this isn't quite enough to teach me Latin. I'm going to need some help. But it was an incredible springboard to get them started. And with some outside input, whether from a live teacher or a grammar translation textbook to kind of explain things more, or some other method. I mean, you yourself used a bunch of supplementary materials from the Orberg verse and elsewhere. Right. They find it's an incredibly useful tool.
Yeah. So what's your background with Latin or language learning more generally?
Oh, well, it's a little embarrassing helping run the Ancient Language Institute. You know, I'm like, as one lately born to it.
Okay.
I didn't study classics in college, didn't study Latin in high school or middle school. I had a great language learning experience in middle school with French. And so I had a wonderful French teacher, Madame Terukina, this Japanese Hawaiian woman, like 5 feet tall, who inspired fear in everyone. But she was actually an amazing teacher. And we did this like immersive French class. We learned a ton of French, learned to speak French really well.
Great.
For being like, 7th graders.
Right.
And then I studied some Russian in college. And yeah, I kind of got interested in medieval literature through reading The Matter of Britain, so Arthurian stuff. And I said, oh, maybe I could do a grad degree in medieval literature. I should really learn Latin. And I ended up meeting Jonathan Roberts, my now business partner, who I co-founded ALI with. And he taught me Latin using this book online. And so we just had weekly online meetings. And we would like read selections from it. I'd ask him questions. He'd quiz me. But then actually the bulk of our time together was composition. And so he had me write a story. And every week I'd write more of the story, and I'd write sentences, and he would kind of correct little things as I messed up cases and verb conjugations. So I'd get lots of practice producing, and he would explain stuff to me in Latin as I wrote. That's how I got started, and eventually we started ALI together. But yeah, I was just his humble student. And he's a fantastic teacher. He's definitely the brains behind the pedagogical operations at ALI. I'm more of the administrator. But yeah, we're now building all sorts of stuff, studying all the various eras of Latin literature from the pre-classical through to the early modern.
Right.
Over at ALI.
Well, so yeah, talk about ALI a little bit then.
Sure. Yeah, it's basically just an online language school. And so we started in 2019 with Latin, Jonathan just teaching Latin to a handful of people. And we had some just wonderful people join us pretty early on, Luke Ranieri being one of them, Catherine Bradshaw, Logan Copella. I can't list everybody, but those are some of the early people. And the Luke one is fun because he very early on taught an advanced level class reading Apuleius, the Metamorphoses, or the Golden Ass. Has kind of two names. And in that class ended up being a bunch of people who became ALI teachers for us. They were the students then, and we've since hired them to teach for us. But yeah, we're doing the same thing that we've kind of described here with Latin, with Ancient Greek and Biblical Hebrew and Old English. And so you mentioned Colin Gorey being at the Living Latin event hosted by Paideia. And so he has written a book trying to do for Old English what Orberg did for Latin, Oswald Berra. And so it's his own story, and it's not formatted exactly like Lingua Latina, but the central idea of kind of gradual exposure to vocabulary and grammar while telling an entertaining story, that's there. And so, yeah, we're running all these classes online for these languages and then trying to build stuff too that helps people.
That's great. That's great. So you've got Latin, Greek, Hebrew, and Old English, right? Is that all the languages right now?
For now.
Great. Okay, well, we were talking about why to learn Latin, and you can go on YouTube or online and find, in the Catholic world, all sorts of things about the importance of Latin. And usually it's not so much about learning Latin as it is about the importance of the use of Latin in the liturgy, for instance.
Right.
And some of the arguments are, more convincing than others. There's the whole the demons hate Latin, that kind of thing. Maybe true as far as I know. But it's not so much about like becoming fluent in Latin, and it's not so much in an educational context. Although, of course, these people, I'm sure, would say priests, seminaries need to teach Latin and things like that. And the church has said that many times, at least in principle. The past several popes have all said Latin is very important, even if that doesn't always get followed through in terms of seminary education. And they've said that for the lay people too. I opened my article with a quote from John Paul II about the importance of young men learning Latin in the context of this Latin competition that was hosted at the Vatican, and I think it was right after he became pope in 1978 or something.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, we could talk about it from theology, read Aquinas in Latin, and liturgy in Latin, pray the divine office in Latin, all the things people normally talk about. But I think that's already evident to a lot of people that is a valuable thing. Not everybody has to do it, but that it's a valuable thing that there be a decent number of people who do that sort of thing. But I want to talk about it in the context actually of not necessarily in a secular context per se, but in the context of the classical education movement and in the context of human formation, because that's where you'll see differing arguments about why one should learn another language or why one should learn classical languages or Latin in particular. And ALI has a very interesting article. I forget if that's by Jonathan Roberts or someone else about classical education and the centrality or lack thereof of serious language learning in classical schools. So I mean, everybody knows there's this ongoing revival. There's this classical education movement, and there's various. It's taking various forms. People talk about. I don't even know that much about all the different schools, but I hear names in the Facebook groups I'm in, Charlotte Mason, Dorothy Sayers, all these different influences on the movement. Obviously some of them are pedagogical theorists. Some of the influences are just great classicists like C.S. Lewis and things like that. But people will give all sorts of different reasons for learning Latin, just like they'll give, again, my experience as a musician speaks to this, because what you hear about why we should have music education in schools is well, music makes you better at math. And that kind of thing.
So what you care about is math, not music.
Right, exactly. Or, it's good for socializing. And, look, I mean, the ancients would make arguments not unlike this in a way, maybe less utilitarian in the sense, it just helps you learn this other discipline or something like that. But, it wasn't so much music for its own sake necessarily back then either. It was for moral formation or things like that. But,
yes.
But whereas as a musician, I'd be more like, well, music is just good, But with Latin, people make similar arguments. They'll say, well, it forms your mind in such and such a way. It helps you to recognize the roots of English words. You'll understand scientific and medical vocabulary better. And I don't know what are the other standard what are the other kind of standard arguments that are given?
Teaches you discipline. It teaches you what a rational system looks like. Things
and
like
these
this.
things are all true and have value.
Yeah.
But they are not necessarily getting to the heart of the value of learning a language, right? And so from where you're coming at the ALI, and a lot of people who are advocates of this particular approach to language learning, what would you say instead?
Oh, yeah, I think it's to read great Latin texts, first and foremost. And I think that some of these arguments, which in truth bear at least resemblance to older arguments for learning Latin about formation and stuff, they are kind of victims, or these arguments are predetermined by bad pedagogy. And so people will end up making weird arguments about the Latin language itself because of the pedagogy they've been exposed to. And so you mentioned this Mary Beard essay, which is a great historian of Rome, says, oh yeah, I can't like sight read Latin, like oratorical Latin. And that's like, fine, okay. But then she argues that, and like, no one can actually be expected to understand Cicero without diagramming him out and stuff. And so this is kind of absurd on its face. I mean, like, these orations we have from Cicero were given in a courtroom to like defend his friends. They were meant to be convincing to the people who were there. There's nothing about Latin that's inherently incomprehensible. And so I think that like, he would be a bad lawyer if he got up there and just like went on and people are like, where's the verb? This is the experience of reading Cicero. Where's the verb? But when you understand Latin on an intuitive level, you're not like mentally searching for the verb. When you have this big periodic sentence and the verb's waiting at the end, that feels like a big bang on the cymbal right at the end. That's like, wow, the effect hits you, rather than it being inscrutable and then having to rearrange it in your mind. And these kind of strange instrumental arguments that, by studying Latin, you learn discipline, or you learn about, learn how to think logically. I think, if I can psychologize, I think they come out of people's experience studying Latin and learning to think logically and learning discipline and appreciating elegant systems, without actually learning Latin, like without having a command of the language. And so they're like, well, it must have been for something. So it was for these other things. And if they could get the experience of putting their feet up at the fire and reading the Gospel of Matthew in the Vulgate and just, loving it.
Yeah.
I think they'd be like, well, okay, obviously the number one thing is you want to be able to read Latin texts.
Right.
And then that comes out really strongly when, you get to something that's the spirit, kind of the language of the church. And so you get access to the prayers and liturgy that were composed in this language. They're meant to be in this language. And then they get translated, and it's not like you can't pray the Hail Mary in English. You should. But when you're like, now I can do Ave Maria and really understand what I'm saying. Or you can read Latin poetry. Poetry is the thing that really, every translation is kind of a paraphrase. Like prose, narrative. You can translate it and you're like, depending on what it is, you're getting a pretty good experience of it.
Right.
But the whole effect of poetry, and I think oratory is similar. The whole effect of it is auditory. It's meant to be heard.
Right.
And you cannot recreate the sound with a translation. You can recreate the sense, but oftentimes the closer you get to the sense, the worse poetry it is.
Yeah.
The more
yeah,
literal of a translation of poem you do of a poem, the worse it's going to be in that language. And so the really interesting, beautiful translations of poetry are kind of their own works that paraphrase the poem.
Right.
And so, yeah, I think
like Pope's, Alexander Pope's,
right, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, this is like, it's not really Homer, but it's cool.
Yeah.
And so I think on an individual level, if you are like, should I learn Latin? Okay. Well, do you want to spend long hours of suffering in order to come out the other side to be able to enjoy reading stuff in Latin? No? Then you probably shouldn't. Yes? Then you definitely should.
Yeah.
And so I think there's multiple arguments, though. That's like the individual argument if someone comes to me and asks me. But honestly, if you have that desire, that question is the answer. Well, of course. Why are you asking? You want to. You should.
Yeah.
There's a secondary argument now, getting back to a different part of your question, about the classical education movement.
Right.
This is a political question. And I don't mean this like, should we vote on it? Well, maybe we should. But I mean it just in terms of, it's not just about me and what I want to do. Like, do I want to spend long hours on this stuff? Yes, I do. So I should. Mm-hmm. But should we, as a people, let's say Americans, have this in schools? And the classical education movement is a collective, subculture of people that have said, yes, we need this. It's really important. And the arguments for doing that are similar to the ones we've laid out, but they take on kind of a new dimension when you're thinking politically, when you're thinking about groups of people. Because then it's not like, should we ask each 8-year-old, do you want to learn Latin? Mm-hmm. Like, you could read Virgil. And like, an 8-year-old would be like, what in the world are you talking about? I want to go outside and play. Virgil, who the heck cares? But you have to force kids to do things they don't want to do because they're good for them. And so should we, make this a priority in our schooling? Because we choose to force our kids to do all sorts of things. Right. And just looking at school, like we're going to make them learn how to read. We're going to make them how to do arithmetic, and all this other stuff. Should Latin be part of that? And the classical education movement, by and large, has said yes. Within the classical education movement, there's all sorts of debates. Do you have to make Latin and Greek part of it for it to actually be classical, or can classical have this more expansive meaning that's like about great books and not necessarily about the language learning? And so kind of like the pedagogy argument. And there's all these people who, within the communicative methods, who disagree, but they're kind of basically on the same page. Same with the classical education movement, I'd say. There's kind of this broad agreement that these more traditional methods and more traditional texts and more traditional disciplines are good, and we need to go back to that. Yeah. What the details of that are is, hotly debated, I would say.
Right. So, one of the points made in this essay, classical, I forget the exact title, was it classical education isn't really classical or something like that on the
classical
website.
Schools aren't really classical, I think.
And one of the points made is that the heart of classical education, in the past was really the study of the classical languages and the reading of works in those languages. And there's another, sometimes it feels like there's the danger of classical education is to create book nerds. Like it's to create people who really like Jane Austen. There's a number of ways to critique like the current state of classical education.
Sure.
Which is a thing still in formation. So it's not that this is all going down the wrong path, but this is still needs to be formed. It still needs to be refined and focused. It's not bashing the movement or anything like that. But somebody else online observed, well, literature, meaning, novels, is given way too high a place in classical education right now. Whereas in the medieval view of the liberal arts was these much more rigorous disciplines. Of course, there's the so-called trivium, the grammar, logic, rhetoric, but then there's astronomy, music, mathematics, geometry, and none of these things they are humanistic, but they're not like the humanities in the modern sense, right? And so you could also argue, well, the classical education is too much following the humanities model, right? Rather than sort of this rigorous training in these arts, right? But then a part of that rigorous training is we're not going to just be reading like, Jane Austen and discussing it with the class. We're going to be learning this language and getting really good at it. We're going to be doing composition exercises like you were talking about, and we're going to be fluent, and we're going to be turning out students who actually have the kind of familiarity with the classical writers that St. John Henry Newman did, that the founding fathers did, or going back to the Renaissance, or going back to, the best of the Middle Ages or the classical period itself. And that's not to say that new things can't be added, because actually I just interviewed a guy about the emergence of musical notation in the Middle Ages. And one of the very interesting things in his book, he's this English musicologist who wrote this book about the first 1,000 years of Christian singing, is that I can't remember the exact quote, but he basically said in the 9th century, the study of plain chant and the sort of the systematization of it was the only like new body of knowledge not familiar to the classical sources that the medievals had to sort of create themselves. Because there was some kind of musical notation in ancient Greece. I don't know if we know exactly how precise it was, but in the Middle Ages, they didn't know what that music sounded like. The ancient Greeks didn't have this tradition of plain chant that they were then trying to sort of codify and theorize and come up with the theory of the modes and all this stuff. This was actually a new science to a large extent.
So much for the Dark Ages.
Right. Well, so, I mean, you can look at, so the classical or the late antique authors, they will write about music in terms of acoustics and the cosmic harmonies and
right.
These philosophical concerns, but to actually have this science of music as a practical thing, that is sort of begins in the Middle Ages and continues to flourish over the next several hundred years, and gets increasingly sophisticated.
And thank goodness they're willing to innovate, because we would not be where we are without that.
Yeah, well, so I went on kind of a tangent, but I guess what I was talking about is the centrality of these more sort of rigorous arts, including language learning, as very, very central. And you guys you and Jonathan host this excellent podcast, New Humanists, and I don't really personally identify with the term humanist that much because it makes me think of the Renaissance, which is, I'm sure it's all great stuff, but it's, it's not the period of history I'm the most interested in terms of philosophy and theology and whatnot. But, you were for a long time going through, the anthology, what is it called?
Great Tradition.
Yeah. The Great Tradition, which I bought.
Richard M. Gamble. Great book.
And it's this giant anthology of writings on education and the liberal arts. from the ancients to, maybe the year, I don't know what the latest one is, like the early 20th century revivers of sort of classical education.
Yeah, mid to late. I think Eric Vogelin's the last one in there.
Yeah, and you guys were going through it. I don't know, did you go through the whole thing already, or did you just sort of...
We go in fits. So
you're taking a break and you're looking at other books at the moment.
Yeah, and then we jump around. But we've been going in reverse chronological order to kind of upset the normal story of like first were the Greeks and then the Romans, then we became medieval and now we're modern.
Right.
And it's the kind of this potted history. So we're like, well, let's start with the moderns and go backwards.
Yeah, that's cool. So it's fascinating because, I mean, for anybody who's interested in trying to think through what education is or what it should be, what it has been. I mean, look, you could look at this with all sorts of things. Is people in the modern day are always trying to reinvent the wheel. They're like, they're starting from this abstract place of like, how would a saint approach this question, this ethical question or whatever? And it's like, well, you could just read the saints and find out.
Someone encountered
you could
this
read,
before.
like, why aren't we reading the doctors of the church and finding out what they thought about like immigration or whatever? You know what I mean?
Right.
And so anyway, in this case, it's education. And so you've got modern authors, you've got classical pagan authors, you've got all these super interesting people in like the late antiquity and the early Middle Ages, or like a Cassiodorus, Urbanus Maurus. Those were some of my favorites. And one of the other things that came up too is not just the centrality of the languages, but of scripture, in sort of like Christian, I don't know what you call it, not Christian classical education, but just Christian education in the, I don't know what era you would
I would say Christian humanism, but that might scare some people. I'll talk about humanism.
Sure. So let's say the Christian authors who accept this growing consensus that the classical authors and the liberal arts have this place in Christian education, this valid place, because it's contested by various people. But there's a pretty clear consensus in the church, at a certain point by 400 or 500 years into Christian history, I guess you could say. And then you're getting people theorizing, well, how should this look practically? And it's interesting too, because a lot of these early like patristic authors, some of them were like trained by, pagan literature teachers and stuff like that, which is also an interesting part of it. But basically, you've got these discussions of the place of scripture in education. And so in St. Basil's Address to Young Men on the Right Use of Greek Literature, something like that. He talks about, well, scripture is kind of the culmination of your education, but people who aren't ready for scripture yet need to like study and take what's best from Homer and the other pagan writers. Take what's morally good, leave what's morally bad, is his basic idea. And then you've got other people, I can't think of a specific example, but I think there are others who have said, well, you should start with scripture and then only then you should have this Christian formation, right? And only then can you venture out into these less pure regions safely, right? But I guess I'm bringing this up similar to the question of language learning itself, is like, how central does this need to be? Does this need to sort of like overwhelm the rest of the curriculum? Can it be just like one course? Like, how do you balance language learning with the other things, and how do you balance scripture? I guess those are two separate questions, but both are coming up on your podcast. Both are coming up on your podcast, and it's a very interesting question to me as someone who, I hope to have kids someday and homeschool them, or, find a good school for them and be able to judge well. And I'm also trying to educate myself. So, this question of like, should I be spending a lot more time memorizing large chunks of scripture? And if so, in what language? Because there's a number of options.
Yes, and all of them.
Right.
No, that's great. And I hadn't actually put this together myself, but I do think these are related questions about the relationship between scripture reading and pagan reading.
Well, because I mean, what I was going to say quickly is these people who are differing about the order in which things should be done, I think they all more or less agree in like, at least like the first millennium, that the purpose of studying these things these pagan authors is to be, and these other arts as well, is to be a better reader of scripture. That's the reason to study astronomy, geometry, all this other stuff. And so then how do we practically form ourselves in that with regard to language learning and the place that it has and everything else?
Yeah, and what is the classical education movement to do with all of this?
Yeah, exactly. It's very open-ended, but I'm just bringing up these topics and seeing.
Yeah, no, it's good. I like the connection. You're a good listener of the podcast. It's good critical line of question. So I think it can be helpful to disambiguate a little bit the tendencies within the classical education movement, and it'll help us maybe not answer the question, but at least like show how the question about the centrality of language learning might be answered by different people. And people can disagree with this, but I would characterize classical education revival in America as having like 4 basic camps.
Mm-hmm.
There's like the Trivium, Quadrivium people. And so this is the proper place to start, I think, because historically speaking, this revival movement started with National Review publishing an old lecture that Dorothy Sayers gave in Oxford, The Lost Tools of Learning, where she makes the argument for Latin and also makes the argument for the Trivium as kind of medieval codification.
When did they publish that? Sorry, I'm just curious because I didn't know National Review had anything to do with that. I've read the Dorothy Sayers thing, but
yeah, in the 70s, I think.
Oh, so that's later than okay, interesting.
Mm-hmm. She gave the address in the 40s, but then they were like, let's publish some interesting old stuff. Cool. So they published this, and independently, 3 groups of people across America read that and were like, we need to start a school based on this. And so the classical education movement really started simultaneously and independently in 3 different places, all because these people read this Dorothy Sayers lecture in National Review. The whole history of this was documented and put together for the first time in National Affairs by my friend Micah Meadowcroft. The article is called Classical Education's Aristocracy of Anyone. And so he goes through and talks about all the schools and the people and how it all developed. It's really fascinating history. And so this, I would say, these are like the medieval scholastic camp. And I'm not a big fan of the Dorothy Sayers lecture itself. I think it kind of makes a hash of the Trivium. We don't have to get into why. But without that lecture, none of this probably would have happened. So we have to be grateful. And I should practice gratitude. That's one camp, I would say. People who want to do this kind of scholastic medieval thing. And it's going to prepare people to be philosophers and, do the quaestio and the objections and stuff that Thomas did in the Summa. It's going to prepare good philosophers and theologians. And part of the reason to learn Latin is to prepare you to engage with the heavyweights of the scholastic tradition. And also Latin is, this rational language that's really well suited to that. Then there's another camp that you're talking about, the people who are going to read a lot of Jane Austen novels. Like that really has nothing to do with the Trivium. And often you'll find these people in these Trivium schools, and they may or may not have arguments for why reading a bunch of novels will prepare you to become a good, scholastic philosopher that, Dorothy Sayers wants you to be. But, humans aren't perfectly consistent, and that's okay. I would call this camp the great books people.
Yes.
And I would say the great books people probably are the predominant majority of the classical education movement. We just need to read lots of great books. We can argue about what the canon is, but doing that will just produce virtue in people and make you smart. And, reading Jane Austen is almost certainly a better thing to do than what a lot of kids are doing in schools in America. Right. So, sure, read Jane Austen. The great books movement, though, is really its own thing.
Yeah.
that emerges out of really like socialist circles in England and then New York City, where we want working men to have the experience of high culture
Right.
that normally posh public school boys in England get.
And this is the approach that I have the most personal experience with, because
Yes.
I was doing a kind of like online great books thing for a long time. Still kind of am, but I don't buy into the methodology necessarily. I'm just reading the books because I want to read the books, not because I believe that this is the best way to organize education.
Right. And look, if socialists were doing it, that doesn't mean it's a horrible thing. Socialists are humans too.
Right. Well, Adler became Catholic and all that stuff. So
Yeah. And I love great books. I actually have the Adler Hutchins collection. They it looks like an encyclopedia set, but it's the great books.
Great books of the Western world. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's where I read my Plutarch and stuff. So they did things like start St. John's. They had the great books program. And Thomas Aquinas College, I think, kind of fuses this great books approach with this kind of medieval trivium and quadrivium approach.
Right.
Great books is probably the majority, but it gets kind of mushed together into the classical education movement. Then there's, I think, a third group that, and there's a lot of overlap, so take this with a grain of salt. But there's a third group that's like, we don't like political indoctrination in public schools. We just want to teach civics and important skills and have authentic discipline and salute the flag. Mm-hmm. That's classical education. That's another tendency within the movement. And so those things can mesh or not mesh with each other, how you like. That one has nothing to do with Latin. The great books one, it's largely in translation. You don't need to do Latin. But, if you get smart kids, interested in reading literature, and they're like, oh, I'd really like to, I really like this Virgil guy. It's kind of interesting. Maybe I should learn Latin. It flows naturally into that. And then there's the fourth group, which I think is probably the smallest group, and it's where my sympathies lie most, which is Latin and Greek, and maybe a couple other things like mathematics should really be basically the exclusive concern of schools, primary and secondary level. And the people going to college should be, in my ideal, utopia, is we return to a place where you can't get into college. This is how colleges were in America for a very long time, and Europe. You can't get into college without demonstrating your Latin proficiency and probably your Greek proficiency as well. And This is the real heart of education. Not because those are the only things worth studying. And this is why I brought up the difference between your individual reasons for studying a language and the political decisions we make.
Yes.
Because educating a population is a political decision. What do we do with all these kids? What should we do with them? And so I would call that the humanistic, Renaissance humanists, and then the classical education tradition. I mean, the humanist won, and that humanistic tradition ran the table in Europe and America for centuries after the Renaissance. And I like that. I think we should go back to that. But those are four different kind of tendencies within the classical education movement. And they all have different reasons for learning Latin, or none at all. And so there's definitely people inside the movement who don't want to do it.
So what's your reasoning for what you just said about colleges should require, we should get to a place ideally in which colleges should/could expect that people come in knowing Latin and Greek?
I would like to see an elite class, a ruling class, kind of the people who are in the universities, scholars, artists, politicians, lawyers, other professionals, having a common culture rooted in Greece and Rome. And the most healthy, vital way to get that is to have them knowing those languages inside and out. I think that's going to be good on a political level. I think it's going to be good on an artistic level. I don't think a lot of people are super happy with where the visual arts or literature are at right now in terms of what's currently being produced. And
Right.
I think you just have to look at the predictions people like T.S. Eliot made that when you lose Greek and Latin as the formative subjects in schools, you are going to cut off literature and the arts from the blood that has given them life in the Western world for millennia. And you're just going to be orphans. And so you might have occasional geniuses, but you're not going to have the broad ranks of artists and critics and writers that are producing really great stuff. And I think like Eliot and people like W.H. Auden and C.S. Lewis, they were kind of the last generation that had that. And we kind of threw that educational system out the window after World War I. It was on its way out, but definitely after World War I it ended. And I think this similar kind of degradation, you see this degeneration in other fields beyond arts and the literature. But yeah, just like conceptions of statesmanship that we get from the Greeks and Romans, I would say, yeah, are kind of foreign to us. And they were not foreign to the founding fathers.
Right.
These people, they were obsessed with Rome.
And they were not foreign to Aquinas or to the Renaissance, people. No. Aquinas was studying Aristotle's Politics, for instance.
Right.
Okay, so, history keeps getting longer and different things peak at different times and in different cultures. I mentioned music, right? So I think it would be foolish to only study music as, sort of acoustics, or to, stick with only what the Greeks said about music and not look at this. In my mind, music really fully flourished as an art form precisely in the Christian West,
yes,
in the second millennium. So I don't think we should even stick with just like Gregorian chant as the sort of the classical. That's not really the classical period. That is very important formative basis, continuing ongoing inspiration for later periods of music. But really, it's the flowering of music. You could debate about the time period, but I would say reaching sort of like its heights in maybe like the mid 18th century in certain ways, or
it's called, that music is called classical for a reason.
Right.
I mean, think about how interesting that is, that we talk about the classics as the Greeks and Romans, and music, what are the classics? Oh, the classical is like Mozart.
Right. And so this also happens with national literatures. So
yes,
like Shakespeare, I don't think there's any really reason to think that Shakespeare is of less value than Sophocles. Obviously you're not arguing that kids in high school should have no familiarity with Shakespeare,
Of course not.
So how do, but my general question then is not about Shakespeare, but how do you deal with the fact that history, there's more and more to learn as history gets longer and longer. And there's these all-time historically great things. I mean, Dante, again, another example, right? There's things people now obviously when you're saying people should read Latin and Greek, you're not saying they should only read classical Latin. Latin encompasses a large chunk of the Christian West, right? So that would give them access to those things as well. But I guess you get my question, is like, what do you do with the fact that there's more and more to learn, and kind of things that may arguably have as much value in terms of particular authors in later periods in European vernacular languages and things like that?
Sure. Yeah. No, great question. I mean, I think that, so on one level, there's a canon, and then there's everyone's personal canon, right? And no one's personal canon is ever going to become the canon for secondary schools or colleges. And your personal canon in terms of the books you think are really important that have really formed you and changed you, I mean, that should be growing and growing and growing. Hopefully yes. People are reading. Hopefully people are studying. And so what we have to do then is figure out what's the best way to lay the foundations for having a healthy culture in terms of the disciplines people learn in school. And I don't think that reading a bunch of literature across times and cultures and languages is really much of a discipline.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I do agree with that. So it's a question of like, how much are schools doing cultural formation as well? Because right now we think that's a big part of the job, right? Is to give these kids a sense of what's the big hits, what's the big hits of, the past 2,500 years or whatever.
Yeah. And I just, that doesn't seem like it's going to form rock solid people.
So this should all be summer reading. Is that the idea? Like, your Shakespeare and stuff. This is stuff that the kids are going to, if they have this kind of formation, they're probably going to be doing this stuff on their own.
And, different stuff for different kids. I'm not going to, I don't want to stop anybody from reading anything. And I mean, the reality is that the people who received these really high discipline classical educations were extremely widely read.
Right.
In English, like if they're English schoolboys. I mean, like that's Lewis. Is you're going to read all this Latin, you're going to read all this Greek, and meanwhile he's obsessed with English romantic poetry or Old Norse. But there is a principle of exclusion. You have to cut certain stuff out. And I think it's kind of addition by subtraction. Take a lot of stuff away and form people in a discipline, in an ability to do something. And this comes back to a pedagogical concept that I think a Latin teacher should think of himself more as a coach than a teacher. Less as someone standing up and giving a lecture and imparting information, and more as training his students to do something. So when you coach baseball, you're like, okay, here's how to bunt. You're going to hold the bat in a certain way. When the ball comes, you're going to do this with the bat. Now watch. And then they watch you do it. Okay, everyone line up. You're going to get 5 pitches each, and you're going to try and bunt every single time. And every time they do it, they're going to do something wrong. Okay, you did this wrong, you need to fix this. You did this wrong. And you're just going to do that over and over and over and over again. That's what's really happening in a good Latin classroom. It's like, okay, here's the concept, whatever. Here's how you do it. Great. Okay, now your turn. And this is where the speaking and writing comes in. And Latin and Greek then in schools, you're just not going to become really good at bunting or throwing a curveball or base running by doing it like once and then being like, okay, now let's learn how to tread water and play water polo. Like this is a bad baseball team. If you're then, okay, let's go golf now. And you're not going to be really good at anything and you're not going to be a very good athlete, period. But yeah, I mean, like Michael Jordan's able to spend all this time on basketball. And guess what? He was also ended up being a really good baseball player. Not as good as, Barry Bonds, but enough to get drafted. And so in a similar way, I think you need this principle of narrowness, developing a discipline, getting really good at these languages, until you're at the point where you can compose dactylic hexameter in Latin. so that when you then go and read the Aeneid, you're like, I know how hard this is because I've done it. And mine is bad. This is good. And then you really understand on a visceral level how good Virgil is. And having that sense for style is invaluable. This is true education in words. And I think education in words is fundamental because if we want students to understand truth and to know truth and love truth, to get at these ideas, these kind of eternal forms or whatever, if you're a Platonist, you can only get there through words, even if words have to fall away at the end in the beatific vision of contemplating eternal truth and beauty. The only ladder is words. And this is my argument ultimately of why this narrow education in Greek and Latin is so important and should be the foundation for education. Maybe not mass democratic education, but education of the highest kind.
Right. This idea may scare some people, but there's this question, right, of can all be educated, in the truest sense of that word.
Right.
I think, in a modern society, we can agree everybody should be able to, read and write and do arithmetic on a basic level, right? And I would go further and say anybody should be able to read a Jane Austen novel and enjoy it, right? So
I think so.
We can't expect that. I think a whole lot of people can learn Latin on some level. I think a lot of people can do that. People learn languages, like you said. Not everybody is eloquent, but people do. Literally pretty much everybody in the world can learn a language, and many of them learn more than one.
Yes.
So simple people, do this. So,
Yep.
But in terms of like spending several years doing only that, then sort of the question becomes, how many people should we expect this of? If they don't do that, what implications does that have about our political system? I'm not a huge democracy booster. I'm not trying to overthrow it or anything, but whatever. It doesn't fire me up that much. But this raises uncomfortable questions. We have this very egalitarian mindset, right? And so the person living in a democracy is inclined to think, well, everybody should be given this kind of education. And it's a question of, the conservative will say, well, we should just raise the universal standards of education, rather than saying, well, some people, a select few, should be given this kind of education. Although in practice, we do accept that because we have, nice, prestigious private schools and tutors for rich kids and stuff like that. So this is, again, another of those things where I'm not formulating a very good specific question, but these are issues that come up, and you've discussed them on the New Humanist podcast to an extent of egalitarianism. There's an essay by, I don't remember the essay, but C.S. Lewis. I remember reading a passage from him again where he was talking about, I think he was talking about Montaigne or something, but he basically said, you can he was talking about public education and universal education. He was kind of saying you can either have a few people who are truly educated, or you can have a lot of people who are not truly educated. That is the basic gist of what he was saying. And I think there's something to that, but it doesn't mean you can't improve the base level of both, sort of levels of education, right? So what are your thoughts on the implications of what you just said for how many people can do this? What should we be expecting of our society at large? Is it just sort of the elites that should be, concerned about this at all?
Yeah, I think that, you need an alliance of high and low on some level, or else you're not going to have a healthy culture. And so
I'll make a music analogy. In the best popular music of the 20th century, these guys had classical backgrounds. These songwriters were trained in music theory, and there was this symbiotic relationship between folk folk art, high art, and popular art, in the history of classical music and jazz and so forth.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, like Liszt. I don't know if that's how you say his last name. I spent all this time like wandering around the countryside of Hungary, like recording folk tunes, and incorporating into his music. And so, yeah, I want the good stuff for as many people as possible. I don't think everyone's going to be interested or capable. Greek certainly makes me feel not capable, speaking personally. But at the same time, like, we have these democratic, egalitarian aspirations, but like you said, we need to take a look around us and see what the actual reality is. And the reality is we have highly stratified forms of education, and we have ways, maybe not sufficient, I don't know, for people to move upwards if they're capable. And that's good. I'm not interested in having some sort of, caste system where only people of pure blood get to study Latin or something.
Right.
But we should be aware that, these differences already exist. And so when we're forming elites, which we're already doing, how would we like them to be formed? Would we like them to be formed to learn to hate their parents and their country and think religious people are morons? Because that's what's happening.
Right.
Or would we like them to be formed some other way? And that should filter down to kind of mass democratic education as well. Like, why can't we have a whole new generation of classicists who grow up in classical education movement or elsewhere, who are producing new translations that normal people can enjoy? That's perfectly plausible. And then you have a whole audience enamored of Greek and Roman stuff, and they receive different educations, but they're all swimming in the same. They're swimming in the same water, and that contributes to a kind of healthy ecosystem.
Because even if you raise the question of like trade schools and stuff like that for teenagers, or teenagers being able to work and take more part in the adult world, if you improve the elementary and sort of middle school level enough, then you can have perfectly literate, at least English language literate, workers, who are what we would define as quite cultured individuals, even if they're not incredible classicists, who are working, handicrafts and things.
Totally. That said, that's kind of the easy resolution of the question, but like, to look around at reality again, what do we currently see with classical schools? I think a lot of them feel pulled in two directions that, at least for now, feel very contrary. One is to be a refuge. Public schools are bad. The quality of the education, the values that students are picking up on, they're bad. These classical schools are a refuge. Got to get my kids out of there. That's good. Yeah. People should have a refuge from bad things. I agree. Yeah. But then they're also pulled in this other direction, towards, excellence or forming elites. If you're recovering classical education, if you're actually recovering it, then it is going to be excellent. It's going to be better. And so, what do you do if you're like, we're going to recover classical education, we're going to teach these kids Latin, they're going to become amazing, and we're going to show the secular world that classical Christian students do so much better than them because, we're reading real stuff and doing real disciplines instead of like free writing about our feelings. Okay, I'm on board. And then you get a classroom full of students who are refugees, who are there because it's a refuge. Like, their parents might be perfectly pious, but like they don't read at home. It's like not a fun activity to sit down and read. There's lots of people like this. They're good people, but they're not like readers. And do you think those kids are going to all like be like, oh, yay, goody, we're going to work hard so we can compose Latin hexameters? No, maybe a few of them will, but most of them won't. You don't have a reading culture in your refugee school. What do you do about that? This is actively being talked about by headmasters and principals. Is like, what do we do? That's hard. I don't know what the answer is, but it's happening. It's happening, and it would be a shame to just choose one and not the other. For classical schools to just become like elite prep schools with good values, like That's good. I want elite prep schools that love God and love America and teach you to love your family and all that stuff and love the Greeks and Romans and churn out these, specimens of students who can run Washington, D.C. and Wall Street and, and do it with virtue. Like, that'd be awesome. But I don't want to just orphan all the refugee students. And neither do I want to just become classical schools to just be refuges, where people can hide. Because that's going to be
well, it can be very
really
diluted
bad.
too, because diluted, I should say, at the time when now this is sort of a boom, and so there's going to be a lot more schools sort of advertising themselves as classical, and maybe it's not that deeply classical.
Right. Yeah, and so if you just make these into little like safe spaces for being a Christian or whatever, that's probably going to get very inward looking. And
similar
unhealthy.
questions to with homeschooling,
Yeah.
All right. So people, I'm going to link to the Ancient Language Institute and the New Humanist podcast and a couple of the articles, including my own, that were mentioned here. And is there anything you want to plug or anything?
Oh yeah. I think if I don't sound too crazy, and you're like, oh yeah, maybe I or my kids should start learning Latin or one of these other languages, then head over to ancientlanguage.com. We have Latin for Kids programs that run the school year, and then we have Latin, Greek, Biblical Hebrew, and Old English classes that run on a trimester basis. And so we're starting our summer term in May, and you could start any one of those languages even if you don't know anything in the language, don't even know how to sound out Greek letters, or how to separate a V and a U in Latin. We will teach you. We'd love to have you. But Thomas, thanks for having me on the podcast. It's been a real treat.
Really
thank you,
fun to
Ryan.
chat. This was great. All right, everybody. Thanks for listening. If you'd like to see everything we've got going on at Catholic Culture, I suggest you go to catholicculture.org/newsletter and sign up for our Insights email newsletter so you can keep up with our written content as well as our podcasts. And thanks, everybody, and I'll see you next time.
The Catholic Culture Podcast is a production of catholicculture.org. Check out our other podcasts, including Way of the Fathers, an early church history podcast hosted by Jim Papandrea, Catholic Culture audiobooks bringing to life classic Catholic writings, and Criteria, the Catholic film podcast featuring deep analysis of great films from a Catholic perspective. You'll find all of this, as well as Catholic news, commentary, liturgical year resources, and much more at catholicculture.org.